It's the 757 at 6 on ESPN Radio 94.1. Matt Hatfield here with you, and we have a special guest with us. He is the voice of the University of Virginia athletics, football, basketball, and so much more. You can follow him on Twitter at Wahoo Voice as we get you set for Saturday's big in-state matchup with the Cavaliers of UVA taking on Old Dominion. And we are your home for Monarchs football here on ESPN Radio 94.1. We say hello to Dave Koehn. Dave, how's life treating you in Charlottesville?
Oh, hey, life is good. After a weekend like the one we just finished up, you'd be hard-pressed to say anything otherwise. But, yeah, it's been a pretty great year here in 2019 for the Hoos, and we're trending that direction hopefully through football season, but off to a good start.
Yeah, before we tackle the football game coming up on Saturday, I know that UVA just had its national championship ring ceremony for men's basketball last Friday, and of course the news coming out about Tony Bennett declining the well-deserved pay raise and instead deferring the compensation, if you will, for his staff and improvements that would benefit the program. Certainly not something you see very often, if ever. Since you're around Tony on a fairly regular basis, Dave, what do you make of it, and reflect as best as you can on that amazing championship journey?
Well, it's nothing that surprises me with Tony. I'll start there because, as I've said for many, many years, what you hear about and what you see with Tony Bennett is really what you get. It's the real thing. I mean, this is who he is as a person, and he's unlike any coach. I mean, I said this on Twitter when that announcement was made, but unlike any coach I've ever met and probably ever will. He really is a unique personality and a unique person, and he lives the credo that he tries to guide his players with, these 5 pillars. I mean, they're a big part of his day-to-day life. So, you know, that idea of servanthood and humility, it's kind of the edicts that he follows. So, you know, something like that is right in line with everything, you know, you'd expect from Tony Bennett. But you're right, you don't see it very often. And it was really neat to see. You know, a lot of this stuff with Tony happens behind the scenes. I know they probably had to twist his arm a little bit to make that public even, but he's doing a lot of these types of things that you don't even hear about. So in that sense, I'm glad it went public. I really am, because I think some of those good deeds should be recognized, and I don't think there's enough good news out there, and I think this is some really good news, and so I thought that was really cool. And then obviously for it to come on the heels of the national championship celebration in terms of the ring ceremony and the banner raising, what a special night that was Friday night. I was so honored to be able to be a part of that, and to see that where you've got thousands of people, you know, getting together at John Paul Jones Arena to witness that, hear some really heartfelt words from Tony, and then I had a chance to interview the big 3 who were all back, and DeAndre Hunter and Kyle Guy and you know, Ty as well. So it was really cool. I guess the best way I can say it's something that you don't get a chance to experience, most people, in their lives. So to be able to experience that here was really fun, especially after everything we've kind of been to get to that point. But the fact that it came the night before that crazy game against Florida State under the lights with a huge fan base, you know, almost 60,000 fans showing up, those are those kind of pinch-yourself weekends that you have every blue moon in this business. And I feel pretty grateful to have been able to be a part of what was an amazing weekend here in Charlottesville.
Oh, yeah, a weekend to remember for all UVA fans and a year to remember for UVA athletics. And let's talk about that game for a second. The Florida State game last Saturday night was some kind of matchup. I watched about 85% of it, edge of your seat to the very end. Shades of 1995, if you will, Dave. And where did that one rank up there for you on the excitement meter of UVA football games you've called?
It's funny because one of the other games that really jumps out to my mind is the game Virginia won at Florida State in, I think it was 2011. It was another crazy finish. That was on the road, though, that Virginia won not once but twice again that one, because I think the kick was missed, and then they had to re-kick it, if I remember right. It's sort of funny how cyclical all these things are. And then you go back to 95, shades of 95, the way that game ended. And Virginia's greatest probably win in football and program history, in that stop of a direct snap to work done right before he got to the end zone, and now it's Cam Akers, another pro caliber running back, taking the direct snap and getting stopped just in front of the end zone as well. Obviously, the ramifications weren't nearly as significant on Saturday night, given the fact that that Florida State team Virginia beat in '95 had never lost an ACC game. This one certainly had, and as a matter of fact, has lost more than it's won of late. But I'll say this, for all the maligning and everybody talking about Florida State being down and some of the silly things that they've been doing in the first 2 weeks, they were not doing those things for the most part throughout that game till the very end. And I think they wore down a little bit. And I think Virginia just broke them a little bit, candidly. I mean, you're talking about 39 minutes with a football to about 16 minutes with a ball for Florida State, and that was the plan from the get-go, to grind them down, to wear them down. This whole notion of will before skill. Sometimes a culture can take a little while to take a true grip on a program, and now in year 4 under Bronco Mendenhall, he's starting to get some players that he feels like fit that mold truly to their core. They recruited to that to fit that, and you're seeing, I think they're reaping the benefits of that, and I really thought that was on display. It was just toughness and grit that won Virginia that football game, but for Florida State, they were turning the ball over. They were committing penalties throughout. They had 11 penalties in the game before for 108 yards.
Yes.
Until the very end, they had very few penalties, and they never turned it over. I think they were leading the country, 35 points off turnovers allowed in the first 2 weeks. No turnovers for the Seminoles. So I think Virginia got their best shot and still found a way to win.
Yeah, I'm with you. ESPN.com had Florida State ranked last in the ACC. I don't believe that for a second. I think they have much more talent than that going into last week. We're talking with Dave Koehn, the voice of the Wahoos, our guest here on the 757 at 6 as we get you set for UVA playing host to Old Dominion. We are your home for ODU football right here on ESPN Radio 94.1. You can also watch the game on TV on ESPN2 at 7 o'clock on Saturday night. Give Dave a follow on Twitter at Wahoo Voice. And Dave, interesting schedule. We'll get to that matchup here and some of the key elements of this UVA team. But for the Cavaliers going from at Pitt, a conference road opener, to a Friday night home opener against an FCS opponent, but not just any FCS, an in-state foe in William & Mary, coached by a former Wahoo and Mike London, then a primetime Saturday night home game with a program that has that national acclaim like we talked about there with Florida State. Now an in-state home matchup against Old Dominion on a Saturday night, which last year pulled a shocker by beating Virginia Tech. So you're not lacking for storylines, are you?
No, I mean, rarely have we so far this season, which has been, it's kind of fun. Obviously, as a storyteller, you want storylines. And I think in some sense, this game, not entirely different from that William & Mary game in the sense that where it falls on the schedule. I mean, in that William & Mary game, Virginia was coming off of an emotional win against Pitt, a team that they had not beaten under Bronco Mendenhall and had never won in Pittsburgh, and it was a really important ACC opener and season opener for that matter. So that one had been scheduled, circled for a long time on the calendar. So, you find a way to win that game, and then you say, all right, then you got Florida State the next week on a primetime showdown. Do you look past, the Tribe? Is there any concern about that? Well, in that case, no, they did not, and that was one of the most encouraging aspects of that to me was the fact that they did not. I thought that they took them seriously right from the get-go, and they really kicked the door down from the start. Now, with Old Dominion coming in this week, again, Virginia's coming off of an emotional win, a wild win on Saturday night against Florida State, and then you've got Notre Dame next week on the road. I mean, shoot, I'll even admit for myself, that's a bucket list experience of my own to go to South Bend and call a football game. So I know the guys are looking forward to that too, but again, does this have the trappings of, one of those trap games, for lack of a better word? And I just think this group so far has been very mature about handling those types of settings and really focusing on the task at hand, because they're going to need to. As you mentioned, all you need to do is look back to a year ago with what Old Dominion was able to do against Virginia Tech to realize that it can happen, and you better be on guard. I think this team is mature enough and good enough to be like that, but again, that will be, to me, one of the big challenges. Bronco Mendenhall was quick to admit so much. He said, look, when you're coming off of a late game on a Saturday night that takes as much of an emotional toll as that one did in those frantic final minutes with one penalty after another nullifying, they had to win that game 3 times. Yeah. And, that'll take a toll, I think, physically and emotionally. So, you've got to find a way to move on. I think this team's up to that challenge, but that's going to be something to watch.
Well, that's what I wanted to hit on with you. You just hit the nail on the head there, Dave. I mean, it's that classic sandwich spot coming off the big ACC game with Florida State before you take on another ranked foe in Notre Dame at South Bend to close out September. Here comes Old Dominion, about a 30-point underdog, playing with the old expression, I guess, house money, if you will. Should the fan out there for UVA be worried about being flattered? Do you draw back to that William & Mary game as the prime example why the concern level should be low? And then to follow up on that, how do you size up Old Dominion, the matchups here, the game within the game against UVA?
Well, I think if you're a fan, you're always a little nervous just by nature, particularly UVA fans. I think they're getting a little better since they raised that banner on Friday night. Having won that game with won the national championship, you always kind of felt like, when's the other shoe going to fall? And really, that's been the problem for Virginia football for the last decade. I think getting past that mentality has been huge, and I think they're starting to. I really, really believe that they are really getting there. I don't know if they're officially there yet, but I think in the fans, though, you may have it a little more. I think some just of that doomsday sensation, but I think they're probably getting past it slowly but surely too. But yeah, you got to be on guard, and I think you're probably doing yourself a disservice if you're not on guard at some level. But in terms of the matchup, I always think it's fascinating when a team goes against a mobile quarterback, and Stone Smart is certainly that. He can beat you with his legs. But, this is not the first time Virginia's seen that. As a matter of fact, against William & Mary, a very mobile quarterback that they brought to the table in that game, which Virginia did a really nice job with. But I think the challenge is probably a little more significant against Old Dominion in that sense. But, I think this defense is real. I think this Virginia defense is the real deal. I think they go, all three levels, very strong. I think the defensive line is significantly better than it was a season ago. That's probably the most marked improvement of this team here in 2019. But, and the other part of it is that you get to practice against it. Candidly, Virginia is not practicing ones versus ones once the season starts. In fall camp, they're doing some of that. So those guys aren't necessarily going against Bryce Perkins regularly, but those experiences you had in fall camp in the offseason going against Bryce Perkins, yeah, that gets you pretty ready. And I think, as a matter of fact, Rob Schneider, one of the linebackers for the Cavaliers, talked about that fact that, what do you learn going against Bryce Perkins in practice? He said, you better be careful with your zone drops, because if you look away, number 3 is racing by you, and you don't need, and that's something that I think can pay real dividends in a game like this, having experienced some of that. So, and the other part of it is for Old Dominion, there's so many new faces. I mean, that's the other part. So it's kind of hard to get a true read for what these guys are all about. But at the end of the day, these guys are playing with house money. I mean, that you're exactly right, and they're going to be playing loose, and they're going to have nothing to lose here. So, I think Virginia's probably up to that challenge. But again, you never know. These are college kids, and how do you respond to these settings when you are a heavy favorite with a big game looming and coming off of a big game?
Oh, yeah, a lot of teenagers and players in their early 20s here. The phrase that I keep coming back to with Bryce Perkins, Dave, is something that Mark Richt, the former Georgia coach, mentioned on the ACC network, and that's his innate ability to wiggle out of trouble, whether it was on that marvelous two-point conversion play or throughout various segments of the ball game against Florida State on his way to an efficient 30 of 41 outing. I get the sense we're watching him now in the process of taking that leap from very good to great, and that also goes with leadership. What do you think?
Yeah, for sure. And he was pretty great throughout a good chunk of last year. I think he's starting to try to do a little more, which might have a little bit of an explanation in terms of some of the mistakes he has made, because he hasn't been perfect. He's made a couple bad decisions this year. He didn't turn the ball over too frequently last year. He's done a little bit more of that this year, but I think part of that is because of the fact that he is trying to do a little more. And, I talked to Bronco Mendenhall a little bit about that. He said, you know what, as long as it doesn't get to be too excessive, I'm okay with Bryce trying to make plays, because more often than not he does, whether it's with his legs or his arm. But the thing that was really amazing was in the second half to see him go 17 of 20 through the air, with 157 yards and a touchdown pass in the second half. And I think some of that has to do with that. The offensive line for Virginia has been the one question mark coming into the season. I think they're still trying to figure that out, but it is a young group, and I think that for whatever reason, to this point in the second half of games, they've gotten better. And I don't know whether that's just wearing teams down a little bit, but when that line is better for Bryce Perkins, obviously he's better. And I think that that's something to monitor, but sometimes he'll make you look dumb whether the offensive line is helping or not, as we saw in that two-point conversion. I mean, granted, he got a great block on that too, so I shouldn't say the line didn't do its part, but his ability to make defenses look silly is just uncanny, and that's a defensive coordinator's worst nightmare. You can have him completely diagnosed, dead to rights, and all of a sudden he's running away from you. And that is something you cannot script, and something that you just cannot truly prepare a team for. So, you mix that component and his ability to run with suddenly starting to, make some plays with his arm as well. Yeah, if he's locked in on both of those sides, you're in for a long night.
3 more minutes with Dave Koehn, the voice of the University of Virginia, here on the 757 at 6 on ESPN Radio 94.1. Give Dave a follow on Twitter at Wahoo Voice as we get you set for UVA playing host to Old Dominion coming up on Saturday night at 7 o'clock, ESPN2 television. You can hear it right here on ESPN Radio 94.1, your home for Monarchs football. And Dave, we know about Bryce Perkins and his dual threat abilities, which you just documented there, and the UVA defense being very sound as a whole. In your eyes, do we have an unsung hero or heroes or even a unit on this Cavaliers football team that's flying under the radar, yet they've been very instrumental to this 3-0 start?
I would say the receiving core, and I don't know if they've been flying under the radar or not. They haven't been putting up gaudy numbers, but that's largely due to the fact that they've got so many different players that have been making plays. It's the deepest receiving core Virginia's had in decades. I think you could make the case. I mean, there are so many different potential targets for Bryce Perkins to throw to. On Saturday night's game alone, you had 3 different guys with 7 catches or more. So, between Joe Reed, Hassis Dubois, Chapman, the transfer from Arizona State, that we haven't even seen Dejon Brissett, the transfer from Richmond, who was coming back from an injury, still looking to get his feet under him. And then Terrell Jana. Man, boy, Jana was terrific the other night. He's probably the most improved player on that team offensively. And then even the tight end, Tanner Cowley, had some big plays the other night. Then you've got the speed guys, the Billy Kemp and the Tavares Kellys. Just a lot of different targets that Bryce Perkins has to utilize. So I think that's a group that is a strength of this team that maybe we weren't necessarily talking about enough coming into the season. I think the 2 transfers that came in as graduate transfers, and Terrell Chapman and also Dejon Brissett, certainly helped in that regard. But I think even besides those 2, you've got some really good targets out there. So that might be the first group that comes to my mind.
Last 2 for you, Dave, and I appreciate the time. Coming off those 2 overtime losses late in the season there in November, some people wondering about where UVA was. And I know we talked about that bowl game with them in South Carolina leading up to it, and then the 28-0 shutout in the Belk Bowl of an SEC team. I really feel like that did wonders for this program going into the offseason. What do you think looking back at it?
Yeah, nobody benefited from a bowl game, maybe this side of Clemson.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, than Virginia. I mean, Clemson's postseason win, he gets you a national title. Tough to compete with that.
Sure.
But I think for Virginia, winning the way they did in that game was so important for this team that had not won its final game of a season since 2004. I mean, it had been a minute. Of course, Virginia hadn't been playing in a ton of bowls. They'd just been struggling, and then obviously we know about the travails they've had against Virginia Tech in that 15-game losing streak. So, when you lose to your rival on the regularly scheduled final game of the year every year, and when that is sometimes your last taste in your mouth, and if it's not, then you end it with the bowl game where you, in the last game prior to this one, you got drugged by Navy. It leaves a bitter taste in your mouth, and you kind of just feel like if we turn that corner, well, I think you started to feel like, hey, we might have turned a corner here in that Belk Bowl because you came back the way you did after a really difficult Virginia Tech loss, a month prior, and you were able to expunge that taste out of your mouth to some degree, and you shut out an SEC opponent, and you start to get this feeling like, you know what, this feels different, and different is good if you're Virginia, the way things have been going over the last decade. So, yeah, I think it really was important for this team, and I think they were able to capitalize on it. I think that's one of the reasons I think that Pitt game was so important out of the gates in the season opener, because you wanted to carry that momentum into this season. I think they've effectively done that here through 3 weeks.
Lastly, Dave, regardless of how Virginia Tech is playing, and even if UVA was to be 11-0 and top 10 in America by that time, some people are going to say they should be judged on how they do against their in-state rival and whether or not they're able to halt the 15-game losing streak to the Hokies come November 29th. Does that have some validity, you feel, or is it overblown?
It does. Virginia's got to beat Virginia Tech sooner or later. It's got to happen. And I think that these guys recognize so much. I don't subscribe to this idea that it would, if you're 11-1 and you lose to Virginia Tech, it's a bad season. No way. Come on. Let's be real.
Right.
But that game does matter more. It absolutely does. And Virginia needs to get over the hump. And the sooner the better. I don't have really words to explain some of the different ways Virginia has found to lose that game in particular last year, but it's got to change. And I think that the team is the first to admit it. It's going to be a wild gamut of emotions going into it this year, because regardless of what the teams look like, it's just the longer it goes, the more the emotions kind of ramp up. And Virginia's got to find a way. I think there's no question about it. So we'll see. Sooner or later, it's going to end. You just hope if you're a Virginia fan, it's sooner rather than later.
Several key games before that, including Notre Dame in a couple weeks. But up first, it is Old Dominion coming up this Saturday, 7 o'clock kickoff with the Monarchs and the Cavaliers. Dave Koehn, our guest here on the 757 at 6, voice of the University of Virginia. You can follow him on Twitter at Wahoo Voice. Thank you so much, my friend. Enjoy the game this weekend, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for having me, Matt.